Hello students, welcome to EPG Pathshala. I am Dr. Anurekha Chariwag, Assistant Professor at the Department of Sociology, Savitribai Phule, Pune University. I am coordinating the paper on Sociology of Gender. Today we are going to discuss the module Women and Development. In this module, we will focus on the relationship between growth and development. Further, we will have a detailed explanation of various approaches such as women in development, women and development, and gender and development. Therefore, we will see how the whole discourse of women and development has changed from welfare to economic self-reliance to efficiency to equality and finally to empowerment. Further, in this module, we will also look into the role of the state, especially in terms of designing policies in relation to women and development. We will also make a distinction between practical gender needs and strategic gender needs in relation to the issues of development within women. Further, we will also differentiate between top-down approaches to women's development and bottom-up approaches to women's development. And we will have a discussion in terms of Human Development Index and Gender Development Index. Genesis. Post-Second World War, the United States and its allies recognized the need for a program to spread the benefits of scientific and industrial progress to the two-thirds of the world, mostly erstwhile colonies. These nations were defined as underdeveloped countries required internal intervention to improve their conditions. Development initiatives began its journey. Soon foreign aid, including food aid and military aid, became a political tool used by the superpowers like USA and the USSR in a Cold War competition to influence the ex-colonial and non-aligned nations of the so-called Third World. With the collapse of state socialist model in the USSR, and Eastern Europe in 1989, the American model of neoliberal capitalism became dominant. Growth versus development. The models of development which emerged supreme following the Industrial Revolution after the Second World War laid emphasis on industrialization, heavy accent on science and technology, ruthless exploitation of natural and environmental resources, and letting loose of market forces. These models initially captured the attention of non-Western economists and development planners because the models sold the dream of prosperity in bold terms and argued that once there is robust growth of the GNP and the GDP, the whole society will develop in all its segments. Women and development. The development process affects women and men in different ways. The after effects of colonialism and the peripheral position of the poor countries of the South and those of the economies in transition in today's globalizing world exacerbate the effects of discrimination on women. Everywhere gender, the socially and culturally constructed forms of relations between femininity and masculinity, is cross-cut by differences in race, class, ethnicity, religion and age. The much criticized binary division between Western women and other, between black and white, between colonizer and colonized is both patronizing and simplest. Feminists have often shared women as socially constructed as a homogeneous group on the basis of shared oppression, but in order to understand these differences, in terms of gender relations, we must interpret them within specific cities and on the basis of historical practices and social practices and not entirely on gender. Prior to 1970, when Esther Boseru published her landmark book on women and development, it was thought that the development process affected women and men in a similar way. Productivity was equated with the cash economy, and so most of the women's work was ignored. When it became apparent that economic development did not automatically erase poverty through trickle-down effects, the problems of distribution and equality of benefits to the various segments of the population became a major importance in development theory. Boseru's works is often taken as signaling of the origins of women in development approach by pointing to women's invisibility and exclusion from development. Paradigm shift in development from women as passive recipient to women as an active agent of transformation. In the early years of international development programming in the 1950s, women were regarded as passive recipients rather than as participants whose major economic role was childbearing and rearing. Development projects geared to address women's practical needs, as such maternal and child health and nutrition. In 1960s and 70s, as development policy began to focus on meeting basic needs as like food, shelter and security, international agencies and governments recognized that women were among the poorest of the poor. In 1970s, women's role in economic development, the ground-breaking book by economist Esther Boseru demonstrated that women made important contributions economic which were being ignored by governments to the detriment of the national development efforts. Boseru also showed that development had different effects on women. Evolution thinking about women's development parallels the changing pattern of women's development programs. Women's welfare remains a central concern in women's development, and each general goal incorporates the preceding goals. Various approaches. Women in Development WID approach. Women in Development WID approach, which grew out of Bossero's work, aimed for the more efficient, effective development through incorporating women-specific projects into existing development processes. The strategies that were developed included adding women's project or project components, increasing women's income and productivity, improving women's ability to look after the household. However, the WID approach did not address gender discrimination, the root cause preventing women's full participation in their societies. WID approach had in some cases unwanted consequences of depicting women as a unit whose claims are conditional on its productive value. It made the mistake of associating increased female status with the value of cash income in women's lives. Although the WID advocated for greater gender equality, it did not tackle the unequal gender relations and roles or the basis of women's exclusion and gender subordination. It did not address the gender stereotype expectations of men. Moreover, the underlying assumption behind the call for integration of the third world women within the national economy was that the women were not already participating in development, thus by downplaying women's role in household production and informal economic and political activities. WID was also criticized for its view on the fact that the women's status will improve by moving into productive employment, implying that the move to the modern sector need to be made from the traditional sector to achieve self-advancement. This further implies that the traditional work often occupied by women in the developing world were inhibiting to self-development. Women and Development WAD approach. In the late 1970s, Women and Development perspective developed in reaction to the omissions in WID. WAD proponents argued that women were already integrated into the development processes but on unequal terms. They pointed out that the development projects increase the demands on women without increasing access to resources or decision-making power, and in effect worked against women's interests. WAD argues that class structures were more oppressive than gender and that poor marginalized women had more in common with men of the class than with women of other classes. Criticisms. Under WAD, according to critics, the women-only development projects would struggle or ultimately fail due to the scale and the marginalized status of these women. Further, the WAD perspective suffers from a tendency to view women as a class and pay little attention to the differences among women, such as the feminist concept of intersectionality, including race and ethnicity, and prescribe development endeavors that only serve to address the needs of a particular group. WAD fails to fully consider the relationship between patriarchy, modes of production, and marginalization of women. It also presumes that the position of women around the world will improve when international conditions become more equitable. Additionally, WAD has been criticized for a singular preoccupation with the productive side of the woman's work, while it ignores the reproductive aspect of woman's life. Value is placed on income-generating activities and none is ascribed to social and cultural reproduction. Gender and Development GAD approach. In the 1980s, the Gender and Development GAD approach movement brought a revolutionary new way of thinking. GAD emphasized on what development can do for women. GAD refocused emphasis on gender from women. The new focus on gender grew out from observations that women's development projects have not been successful in improving women's conditions. This approach pointed out that the women have been systematically subordinated and assigned secondary or inferior roles to men, and their needs have to be considered in isolation from the larger context. They sought to make women an integral part of every development strategy. It was thought that development projects would become more efficient by decreasing women's reproductive workload, lightening household responsibilities through better access to water and fuel, and increasing the productive efficiency income generation, mainly in traditional women's activities, access to training credit. With GAD, the rationale for conducting women's development program began to shift from efficiency to equity and empowerment. Development affects men and women differently, and men and women will have different impacts on projects. Both must be involved in identifying problems and solutions if the interest and well-being of the community as a whole are to be furthered. Development starting addressing strategic gender needs and rather than mere practical gender needs. Under the concept of practical gender needs, women are identified in the socially accepted roles in society. PGNs do not challenge, although they arise out of gender divisions of labor and women's subordinate position in society. PGNs respond to immediate perceived necessity identified within a specific context. They are practical in nature and often address inadequacies in living conditions such as water provisions, healthcare, and employment. They are needs shared by all household members, yet identifies as PGNS of women who assume responsibility for meeting these needs. It includes water, health, income earning, housing, family, food provision. Strategic gender needs are the needs women identify because of the subordinate position of women. They could vary according to particular context related to gender division of labor, power and control, and may include issues such as legal rights, domestic violence, equal wages, women's control over their bodies, etc. Meeting strategic gender needs assist women to achieve greater equality and change in existing roles, thereby challenging women's subordinate position. Strategic gender needs include abolition of sexual division of labor, alleviation of the burden of domestic labor and childcare, removal of institutionalized forms of discrimination such as rights to own land or property, access to credit and other resources, freedom of choice over childbearing, measures against male violence, participation in decision making. Criticisms of GAD approach. GAD has been criticized for emphasizing the social differences between men and women while neglecting the bonds between them and also potential for changes in the roles. GAD also does not dig deep into the social relations and so may not be able to explain how these relations can undermine programs directed at women. It can also does not uncover the types of trade-offs that women are prepared to make for the sake of achieving their ideals of marriage or motherhood. Another criticism is that although GAD perspective is theoretically distinct from WID, but in practice a program seems to have element of the two. While many development agencies are now committed to a gender approach, in practice its primary institutional perspective remains WID. There is a slippage in reality where gender mainstreaming is often based on a single normative perspective as synonymous to women. Development agencies still advance gender transformation to mean better economic empowerment among women. Alternative approaches. An alternative way of forming development has evolved out of grassroots experiences. This alternative view is based on interactions at the local level. Ideas and policies are shaped by everyday practice rather than by dominant development theory. Being aware of their interests and needs, the local people are capable of promoting their own development if their initiatives are recognized and supported. There are many examples that clearly show that these grassroots movements result in empowerment for poor women. The local NGOs have created space for women's voices to challenge and change the development plans that are biased against women. Women should be the agents of development. Other approaches with different paradigms have also played a historically important role in advancing theories and practices in gender and development. The structuralist debate was first triggered by Marxist and socialist feminists. Marxism, particularly through alternative methods of state socialist development practiced in USSR, China, Cuba, challenged the dominant liberal over time. Neo-Marxist proponents focused on the role of post-colonial state and development in general and also on localized class struggles. Capability approach. Capability approach is an approach to welfare economics conceived in 1980s. Amartya Sen brings in a range of ideas that are excluded from traditional approaches. The core focus of capability approach is on what the individuals are capable of doing. The approach emphasizes functional capabilities, that is, ability to live to old age, engage in economic transactions, or participate in political activities. These are constructed in terms of substantive freedoms people have reason to value instead of utility, happiness, desirement, and all are access to resources such as income, assets, and all. This approach is emphasized on the human well-being and the importance of freedom of choice, individual heterogeneity, and the multidimensional nature of welfare. Sen's concern for capability approach is that individuals can differ greatly in their abilities to convert the same resources into valuable functionings, beings, and doings. For example, those with physical disabilities may need specific goods to achieve mobility. Martha Nussbaum's account of capability differs from Sen and is motivated by the concept of human dignity. Access to these capabilities is required by human dignity, but it does not mean that a life lacking in any of these, whether from external deprivation or individual choice, is less than a human life. Choice and deprivation are, however, different. If someone lacks access to these capabilities, for example, to be a well-nourished bodily health, that reflects a failure by society to respect her human dignity. If someone chooses not to take up her opportunities due to certain capabilities, for example, to adopt an ascetic lifestyle or fast for religious reasons at the expense of her bodily health, respecting that choice is also an aspect of respecting her dignity. The Human Development Index and the Gender Development Index, HDI and GDI. Amartya Sen's capability approach provided way for one of the most comprehensive development indicators, the HDI index, the Human Development Index developed by economics Mahbub-ul-Haq, is a composite statistic of life, education and per capita income indicators which are used to rank countries into 4 tiers of human development. Gender-based development index is an index designed to measure of gender equality. GDI, together with gender empowerment measure, when introduced in 1995 in the Human Development Report written by United Nations Development Program. The aim of these programs was to add a gender-sensitive dimension to Human Development Index. It addresses gender gaps in life expectancy, education and incomes. Millennium Development Goals. The Millennium Development Goals are the 8 international development goals that were established at the Millennium Summit of the UN in 2000 to mitigate gender imbalance and to usher in a world order by 2015. They are again rephrased under Sustainable Goals, which are 17. Sustainable Development. The term sustainable development was brought into common use by World Commission on Environment and Development and its seminal report on Our Common Future. According to the Commission, sustainable development is a development that meets the needs of the present without compromising the ability of the future generations to meet their own needs. This definition contains within it 2 concepts: the concept of needs, especially the essential need of the world poor, which overriding priority should be given, and the idea of limitations imposed by the state of technology and social organization and the environmental ability to meet present and future needs. Salient features of sustainable development. Some of the salient features: it is an alternative design for development which by definition should be environmentally benign and eco-friendly. The present generation should meet its needs without compromising the ability of future generation to meet their needs and ensure that productive assets are available to future generations are not unfairly diminished. Those who enjoy the fruits of economics development today must not make their future generations worse off by excessively degrading the earth's exhaustible resources and polluting earth's ecology and environment. That is a symbolic relationship between consumerist human race and producer natural system. Environment and development is not mutually exclusive. It is essential to sustainable development and healthy economy. Sustainable development has 2 major aspects: internally sustainable development and externally sustainable development. Without both, no real sustainable development would exist. Sustainable development is accountable to the poor and ensure that poor should have adequate access to sustainable and secure livelihood. And finally, women's close proximity with nature often victimizes them during environmental degradation, as often they are the primary providers of the family. Due to this, often women take up the leadership in ecological movements, and women's participation in Narmada and Chipko movement proves that. In conclusion to the Women and Development module, we have discussed about how Millennium Development Goals, especially Millennium Goals, is related to women's development, and also how Sustainable Development Goals is also in a way directly related to the whole issue of women's development. We have also theorized sustainable development. Further, we have focused on the role of government and in terms of NGOs in terms of designing the various approaches towards women and development. Further, we have looked into the interlinkages between development, environment, sustainable growth, gender justice. Further, we have also looked into the importance of access of resources, especially in terms of credit, technology and in terms of decision making power. At the end, we have concluded with the argument that we need to make development process more participatory so as to enhance women's role within the whole development process. Thank you.